Special Collections at London Metropolitan University. We're based on Aldgate campus. We look after the University Archive, the Trades Union Library collections, the Archive of Irish and Britain, the Frederick Parker Chair and Archive, and the E&A Waits Furniture Business Archive. We are open Tuesdays, Thursdays and Fridays from 10 to 5 for students and staff, but also for the wider community. Booking is available for appointments via our website. We're also on Twitter and Instagram if you want to follow us. We do regular posts about news, events, also updates on collections work that we're doing around cataloguing. And we also are online via a catalogue, which is collections.londonmet.ac.uk. Cool. So let's start by introducing Irish and Britain. So today we're lucky to be joined by Susan Carhill, who is the Heritage Project Manager on the project we'll be discussing today, which is a 50th anniversary project. We're also joined by Roisin Jones, Heritage Project Assistant, and Rosa Gilbert, who is Heritage Researcher. Just to introduce the Irish in Britain, it's a national membership body for Irish community organisations in Britain, providing support and representation for a diverse network and championing the Irish community's interests. Formerly known as the Federation of Irish Societies, established in 1973, the Northern and Southern federations came together to create a single national body. Their membership is made up of societies, groups, clubs, services and individuals who became friends of the Irish in Britain. Irish in Britain deliver work in many different areas, including research into the Irish community in Britain, policy and advocating for the Irish community, parliamentary work, campaigning and community development. For more information about Irish in Britain, you can go to irishinbritain.org. Cool. It's well worth it, so go check it out. Okay, so I'm going to ask a series of questions, but it's going to be relatively informal. And then after we finish that, like I say, we'll have 15 minutes or so for your questions, which will hopefully all go through the chat. And our person off screen, Jeff, will be shouting those questions out for us. So just to kick off, can you first tell us about how the project, the 50th anniversary project began, and to celebrate that, why you chose oral history interviews specifically?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Yeah, so as you mentioned, the Federation of Irish Studies was founded, a Federation of Irish Societies was founded in 1973. So last year, 2023, was the 50th anniversary. And Irish in Britain decided to mark that by creating an oral history project and received a grant from the National Lottery Heritage Fund to do so. And the idea around the project was to capture the stories of Irish immigration to Britain, Irish community organisation in Britain, because the Federation of Irish Societies, which became Irish in Britain, was a group of community centres, community organisations and Irish societies. And also the Irish population in Britain it's an ageing population. So the stories, the memories, the experiences of Irish immigration to Britain they're at-risk stories. They're stories that will disappear if they're not captured. So it was considered a really important time right now to do this for like the marking of the 50th anniversary, but also to capture those at-risk stories. Rosa, do you want to talk more about the oral history, why oral history is an important methodology for capturing those stories?
Yeah, so there's a few aspects to it, I suppose. There's the idea that we're capturing at-risk stories, so it's people that might not normally tell their story via biography or they're seen as sort of the little man of history rather than the big man of history. So history, the idea of history from below, popular history, and so it's the lives of ordinary people essentially, but maybe they've done kind of quite amazing things in their lives quietly, which would not normally garner attention of historians. So by undertaking an oral history project, you can gather some of these stories, and it helps then to sort of connect life to times, I suppose, and paint a broader narrative. There's also the fact that we could use volunteers to do the oral history interviews. So part of the project was to train up, we trained up 54 volunteers in oral history. Many of them were from the Irish community. Not all of them were, but many of them were. So then the idea was that the Irish community itself could be collecting its own history and gathering its own historical sources. And in training those volunteers as well, I think 16% had never volunteered before.
Yeah, 16% had never volunteered before, and I think 45% had never worked on a heritage oral history project.
Okay.
So yeah, there was something really exciting about getting people involved in, as Rosa said, the capturing of their own, of the community's own history.
And when you involve volunteers in capturing oral history as well, what you're doing is, by creating those historical sources, it's kind of a co-creation of the sources. So where a historian might go to an archive and find material, whether it's sort of official state documents or newspapers, obviously the creation of those sources is kind of multifaceted, but it is a singular source. When you create oral history sources, that's something that's created as well by the person doing the interview. So the person interviewing is also affecting how that source is developed. And so when a historian will use that in the future, or when someone listens to that interview, it's not just someone telling their story, but it's a story told via the interview by the volunteer. So it's quite a unique form of gathering data.
Yeah.
I think the beauty of oral history as well is it's so intimate and immediate, and you're listening to someone's voice, and you can hear their emotions, and you can hear their lived experience. Like there's nothing like it. That was like one of the beauty of, like, when because the three of us trained as oral historians and we took histories, and just that the privilege of sitting in a room with someone and listening to their life is, there's nothing like it.
Yeah.
Roisin, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so again, just on the volunteers and reaching out to those who would have an interest in being involved, we had amazing feedback almost instantly. There was an appetite for it, an appetite to capture the stories, to share stories, and to be the person taking down those testimonies. And for me personally, like Susan said, we were all trained, we took the oral histories as well. It was a real privilege to listen to the accounts. We had some people who thought, you won't want to listen to my story, it's not going to be very interesting, had a very boring life, and it just couldn't have been further from the truth. Every person's story was really valuable, really interesting, and I feel like I learned more about the Irish over here in Britain than I do about the Irish, that I ever would have known about the Irish being Irish and coming from Ireland. You know, it's learning about that experience away from home, the community, and also with our volunteers who are all amazing. A lot of the time we were connecting them or introducing them to some of these member organisations. So they were coming away with this newfound connection, which would just help, you know, not just publicise the great work all those organisations do, but just finding these new places and homes and meeting these peoples of all different generations from Ireland. And they just all got on so well with each other, you know, having that, it was like a passion project in lots of ways for some people, but it was just connecting people through this love of shared oral history.
And there's also something to be said for the kind of tradition of storytelling in Ireland as well, which has, you know, a long history and is important kind of cultural facet. And especially when you think about the experiences of the Irish in Britain that we've kind of been learning about over the last 50 years, there are lots of stories of kind of adversity and a community sort of facing lots of difficulties, whether that's political, cultural, discrimination. And so by telling a story, there is a kind of sense of providing a testimony to that kind of survival, but also to kind of overcoming that adversity and establishing the kind of resilience of the community and the strength of the community in the face of some of that adversity. So yeah, I think it was getting those stories from the horse's mouth, as it were, was very valuable.
And you can feel that when you're in the room with someone, and maybe someone has never had someone listen that closely and intently to their life story before, or that they haven't considered their life story as having any importance, and yet someone is sitting here like really paying attention. You can feel how significant that is to someone,
Absolutely,
and for their understanding of their place within the community and within history as well.
Yeah, and sort of collecting the language and the colloquial terms and getting the accent, and like you say, with storytelling, the richness of telling that story, you know, with an accent, but also, you know, that idea of health and well-being, sharing that story, you know, feeling less isolated perhaps, and being able to. Yeah, really interesting. So before you started to collect the oral history, what training did you kind of embark on? Did you feel was important?
Well, yeah, we had a few different levels of training. So we worked really closely with the Oral History Society based in the British Library. And we had a wonderful trainer called Sarah Lowry. And she did online and in-person introduction to oral history training. It was like a day-long training for our volunteers, and we did that as well. And some of our volunteers also did dementia awareness training because we were interviewing a lot of elderly people. And that was done in-house with Irish in Britain, because Irish in Britain have a campaign around dementia awareness. So Zibby, who's one of the Irish in Britain team, she did that dementia training for, I can't remember how many, I think it was about 16 volunteers.
Sessions,
did that training. So that was really valuable. And that was also to think about how to make the exhibition accessible for everybody. I did project management training with the Oral History Society as well, which was extremely useful in terms of thinking about workflow and all of the kind of data management and sensitivity management end of things. And then the three of us also did, I think, something that was extremely valuable, which was trauma-informed interview training. And we did that with ICAP, which is the Immigrant Counselling and Psychotherapy, which is one of Irish in Britain's member organisations, and they provide free counselling to Irish people in the UK. And that was both to support ourselves in terms of, because a lot of the histories, a lot of the stories we were taking were traumatic, were difficult. So that training was to support us in terms of thinking about how we manage an interviewee potentially becoming re-triggered, re-traumatized, or ourselves responding to some of the material that we were encountering, because you are in a really kind of intimate space when you're doing an oral history, so that we could support ourselves, but also support the volunteers if they were in similar situations, and the interviewees, and then also to kind of manage our own well-being as the project, because we had a extremely tight time frame, so it was an intense project in lots of different ways.
And do you all have backgrounds in oral history before, or was it
just
Rosa?
I'd done training with the British Library over 10 years ago, and I'd sort of done intermittent bits of oral history. I did a project around parliamentarians I volunteered on, and then I did my own oral history interviews for my own research with ex-prisoners in Belfast. So I had sort of some experience, but this was kind of a new level of experience, because the level of raw conversations was something that I hadn't kind of been exposed to. A lot of the people I'd spoken to in the past had given interviews before, or had some kind of interest in their lives shown. So yeah, that was quite novel for me. But we also did GDPR training.
Oh, we did.
Yeah, forgot about that, because of the new recent legislation. This is sort of like a bit more boring technical aspects of it, but because the GDPR legislation, or historians and archivists have to be really attentive to various issues, particularly around the naming of third parties. So that's something that we're kind of now archiving the oral histories, we're sort of glad that we went on that training and have some appreciation for it. And then we did the equipment training as well for volunteers. We produced some videos to show how to use the recorders, because actually they're quite straightforward, but they're a little bit complex. So it was important to make sure we got that right.
Which ones did you use?
Zoom
There
H5.
we go.
Yeah.
Nice.
Recommend Zoom H5. They're very user friendly.
Put together a.
Sponsored by Zoom H5.
If you want to send some free. And we put together some volunteer handbooks which had detailed information of guidelines of how to use the equipment, reminder, turn your phone off before the interview.
Yeah.
After the interview, don't just run out the door, stay and have a cup of tea and make sure that the interviewee is okay after telling their life story, kind of thing. So yeah, we kind of had a framework of training and support for our volunteers, and I hope that they found that useful and enjoyed the experience.
Sure they would have done, yeah. So how did you find the interview process itself, and did anything surprise you or impact on you particularly?
I think we were discussing this. It was really fascinating, everyone being so individual, like Rosa saying there, it's raw. But what I found that surprised me was the level of how some of the interviews affected me, or as much as we're talking about the training that we had, listening to the person's lived experience and wanting to help them during that interview and post-interview. There were some occasions where it might have been personally triggering, or it might have been hard on an emotional level not to have shown the emotion for that person's story, because you want to show empathy, but also you're listening and you're the person listening, you're letting the person speak. The interview is not about you, it's about that person. And on many occasions, because they were all really remarkable interviews, there were times where something might have been said that you just weren't aware was going to be coming at you at all, so there'd be the level of trying to stay professional, listening, but on a human level, it's quite hard to listen to some stories and not feel affected by them. Certainly I was, from my personal, being from the north of Ireland and speaking about experiences of those who left during the Troubles and anti-Irish sentiment and the feelings of other people from Ireland towards people in the north and all of that. So it just so it was really fascinating, but it felt like I had so much in common with that story already, even though it wasn't my story, it was that person's story. And we've talked a little bit about Insider, haven't we? We want to talk about that a little bit, because having that experience and interviewing somebody from Ireland, being Irish.
Yeah, because insider interviewing, so when someone from within the community is interviewing someone else from within that community, there's pros and cons to it, especially if you're thinking about you're recording a historical document for an archive, so the person listening to it may not be from that community, so you have to make sure that everything is explained, which can get forgotten about in an insider interview. But one of the benefits of an insider interview is that there's this level of trust and comfort that is almost automatically created when, I think for a lot of our interviews, people felt comfortable talking about their own experiences because they're talking to someone else who's had similar experiences.
But then it depends why they've left Ireland.
Yes.
They might not want to be talking to other Irish people about some of those experiences. I mean, I was thinking about this in relation to I don't have any Irish heritage. I've got an English accent, and I often found this thing of keeping yourself out of the interview, or trying to stay slightly distant and not making it about you, not interrupting and not kind of leading. Sometimes there'd be situations where interviewees would kind of ask me, "Oh, do you know about that?" And it's hard for me to sort of keep out of that, because you want to show, actually no, I do, I am a bit slightly knowledgeable about Ireland, about Irish things, right? You don't want to look like an ignorant Brit kind of thing. And I had to sort of check myself on that, because actually it doesn't matter what they think of me during the interview. I can always say afterwards, yeah, I knew what you're talking about, but yeah, so that was a big, as being a kind of doing an outsider interview, I suppose that was one thing that I was always conscious of. And yeah, I mean, I was definitely surprised by people's emotional reactions. So like seemingly straightforward questions could lead to very emotional responses, something like as basic as tell me about the house you grew up in, or what was your school like, can people have traumatic stories relating to lots of aspects of their lives, and I hadn't sort of that hadn't happened to me before in oral history interviews. So that was something, and the trauma training was so useful for that. And also, actually, Sarah Lowry's training with the Oral History Society, she was very good at explaining how, you know, how to respond to someone who kind of breaks down, or and at what stage you kind of offer to turn off the recording equipment and that kind of thing. The other thing that I found really interesting and kind of made me reflect on my own understanding and attitudes was interviewing second generation Irish people, because it's something that I hadn't really come across much in terms of sort of research and academic work, and I was quite ignorant about, and didn't really sort of appreciate the place of second generation and third generation amongst kind of migrant communities in general, I suppose, but particularly the Irish community. And then doing interviews with second generation, third generation Irish people really brought a new appreciation, a new understanding of those experiences and that kind of identity, that really kind of unique and fascinating expression of identity. And we see with like the Pogues, for instance, you know, the importance of like things like London Irish and what that means in terms of culture, in terms of expression of identity.
Yeah, and I think kind of building on that, what I started to really like, I think I only had a very kind of surface idea about the relationships between Ireland and Britain. And as you talk to people, and as you start to appreciate more the kind of second and third generation identity, you're seeing that those two, like Ireland and Britain, are so intertwined in these really complicated ways that, like, it's just really fascinating to kind of to listen to a whole range of people's life experiences, and the movements back and forth across those countries. It's not like I think I had a quite a simplistic idea of like Ireland, England, which completely fell apart in doing a project like this. Even though I, like, as an academic, and I've researched, my background is in Irish literature, but researched lots of writers who left Ireland and who lived here. But yeah, it really changed my idea of the relationships between, and I say relationships, the relationships between those two, Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales.
Well, I think it's a really important point as well, isn't it? Once you start asking questions, is to try to remove yourself from the answers and just allow the person to explore. But also, if I think we were talking earlier about triggering something, you know, in a normal conversation outside of this, you may engage and, you know, debate, but in this context, you know, it can be challenging to keep out of it.
It's such a skill, like it's crap oral history interviewing. And it's that is one of the hardest things, is to just keep yourself way back, but also to tell the interviewee, because they're not, if especially if they've never taken part in an oral history interview before, they're expecting it to move more like a conversation. So you have to say to them, I'm going to stay way back. I'm not going to ask. And often interviewees will say, "Oh, you need to ask me another question now." And it's very hard to
and it accept pauses. You know, understand that pauses are good and give space for people to think and reflect and maybe speak again. But yeah, and also I suppose that kind of thing of distance. You know, I had a lot where interviewees would ask me to sort of validate or affirm, you know, is that okay, or do you agree with me? And they'd want kind of like a more like a conversation. And again, that's hard, because you don't want to, you want to give some kind of affirmation, because they're telling their life story, and they're looking for, you know, especially if they're slightly nervous, they're looking for some kind of affirmation. But also, you don't want to kind of colour what their perception of you, and have that impact on how they might sort of continue their story. So yeah, it is a thing to sort of consider and balance in your mind as you're doing it.
Yeah, it's my experience of oral history. Sometimes when you're listening to an interviewer, is their expectation going in for specific answers. So you can find when you're listening, actually the questions they're asking are quite leading. And in any dynamic between a human being, if somebody, leads you down a path, you normally, particularly if you're a bit wary of the situation or nervous. So yeah, it is taking that time to step back and just allow the person to explore, just like an interview, I guess. Someone asks you a question, don't just like dive in, give somebody a bit of a pause and just to kind of collect their thoughts a bit. So yeah, definitely a really good skill. I think we touched on this slightly, but oral history work can be quite challenging, particularly if the conversation sparks, a difficult memory. You talked about the network and the training. Was there any wider sort of support you had in place, sort of after vicarious trauma perhaps may not have happened 3, 4, 5 months after? Did you find any of those residual kind of feelings coming through, and how did you kind of engage with those? Sorry. That's too hard.
We did sort of talk amongst ourselves.
We did.
In a way which we kind of oral history interviews are confidential, and between the three of us, because we were listening to other people's oral histories, we were doing the oral history interviews, so we had a kind of vow of a confidential space where we could share any issues that we thought arose, and it was also a way to kind of discuss the logistics and the practicalities of does this part of an interview need to be closed or are there GDPR issues or whatever. But it was also a way to sort of reflect on our own oral history techniques, our interview techniques, and our feelings around it, particularly for these two who've got experience of migration themselves, my family history as well. I've got sort of intergenerational my grandparents were Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe, so there were kind of similarities that I spotted in my own experience or family experience, and in interviews as well. So yeah, we kind of had that as a safe space to discuss amongst ourselves with a kind of vow of confidentiality that we could use to sort of and
it was really important, wasn't it? It was important, and it was very like a natural thing. We'd come together
daily.
It would happen, and it would be, and this is why it's so great to work in a team, because we were having the same very similar experiences, but something might have happened where you were perhaps on your own doing your own oral history. Think, well, who can I talk to about that? And it was great that we had that safe space. And again, as we were saying, all the oral history is confidential, but the fact that we could almost bounce off and just say this had happened or that had happened, and learn from each other and learn from each other's experiences. And yeah, again, to go forward, we've always had that in our mind, haven't we? Even if volunteers that have come forward and said, oh, this actually happened, or subsequently we met people during our tour, the exhibition tour as well, and people were sharing stories, or if they may have been triggered by listening. And we had a lot of that. We had quite an emotional reaction to people listening to other people's oral histories, and there was a help. We were pointing people in the right direction, weren't we? Really, they wanted to speak, or they wanted to speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, and ICAP were fantastic. That we had and Rosa, in the handbook, we had created a list of resources for people, for kind of volunteers, but also in the exhibition we pointed people towards ICAP in case any of the material was triggering. But yeah, the fact that we had each other was I don't know what'll I do without you.
No, it's great. I think you do need that network. You do need that chance to kind of decompress.
And
just just have those conversations.
And and it did make us, I think, all reflect on, as Rosa said, our own family histories. And when you're listening to someone talk about their life and tell their life story, they're also talking about their parents and their grandparents, and so you're like, often you're like listening to stories of intergenerational trauma, and you're thinking about that, and you're reflecting on that in your own family as well, which is really interesting. And